Now, first, let's break down the second line of business argument. Under the second line of business argument, a cannabis business owner argues that it is engaged in essentially two trades or businesses. Thus, Section 280E should only apply to the line of business where cannabis is trafficked. Now, in 2007, Californians helping to alleviate medical problems, CHAMP, that's what they'll call them, they raised this exact argument. CHAMP was a nonprofit medical cannabis community center whose members had debilitating diseases. They operated on paper with a dual purpose. Its primary purpose was to provide caregiving services to its members, and its secondary purpose was to provide medical cannabis in compliance with California law. Now, in providing the caregiving services, CHAMP offered field trips, social events, educational classes, and distributed food and hygiene supplies. CHAMP argued that its business expenses for its caregiving services should not be subject to Section 280E because the expenses were separate and apart from the petitioner's supplying of medical cannabis. The U.S. Tax Court actually agreed, and they held that CHAMP could not deduct business expenses for supplying cannabis, but could deduct business expenses associated with the caregiving services. The court, after considering, quote, the degree of economic interrelationships between the two undertakings, that CHAMP was involved in more than one business. The court did not apply Section 280E to the part of the business where CHAMP provided caregiving services because the caregiving services were substantially different from CHAMP's distribution of medicinal cannabis. CHAMP could deduct the business expenses related to the caregiving services because these expenses related to the separate caregiving services, which are justified under Section 162. But despite a victory in this case, the U.S. Tax Court rarely accepts the second line of business argument. Check this out. In contrast, in 2012, Martin Olive, an owner of a medical cannabis dispensary in California, unsuccessfully argued that his company operated two separate businesses. Similar to CHAMP, Mr. Olive argued that he should be allowed to deduct business expenses associated with his business's caregiving services. But in this case, the tax court disagreed and held Olive could not deduct expenses from his caregiving services. Using the degree of organizational and economic interrelationship of the business, that test, the court used that to determine the parameters of his business. And in this case, the court actually distinguishes Mr. Olive's business from the business of CHAMP, even though they're two separate cases. Now, the primary purpose of Mr. Olive's medical cannabis dispensary was the retail sale of cannabis under California's medical cannabis law. The business provided minimal activities and services, which is different from CHAMP. Now, the differences between both companies was stark. Mr. Olive's business did not separate its dispensing of medical cannabis with its caregiving services, whereas 72% of CHAMP employees worked in the caregiving business and provided its caregiving services regularly, extensively, and substantially independent of providing medical cannabis. CHAMP rented space at a church for peer group meetings and yoga classes, and the church did not allow cannabis on the church's premises. All of Olive's employees worked in the cannabis business and regularly sold and helped patients consume cannabis on site. Mr. Olive's business also had a single bookkeeper and accounted for all of its business dealings, thus proving that the business was truly a single entity. Both the Olive and CHAMP case establish that the tax court will hold a cannabis business to a strict standard in establishing that it offers multiple line of businesses, which is why it's so hard to win on the second line of business argument, but I'm just trying to show you that this legal argument does exist. CHAMP and Olive are the current templates in determining whether a business expense is deductible under Section 280E. A cannabis business can deduct business expenses related to a separate trade or business that does not involve trafficking of cannabis, but the U.S. Tax Court has reaffirmed its strict standard when analyzing this argument in numerous cannabis cases since Olive. A couple you should go look out for is CHAMP versus Commissioner in 2007, You should also see Beck versus Commissioner, which is a 2015 case. In that case, they disallowed deductions under the second line of business argument because the petitioner in that case did not sell any non-cannabis related items or services. Also, another case in 2015, Canacare Inc. versus Commissioner. In that case, the court held that the petitioner was a single medical cannabis dispensary because even though it received income from non-cannabis related items like books and t-shirts, all income derived was incident to its cannabis business. And another case, if you're really trying to nerd out, in 2018, Alterman versus Commissioner. In that case, the court held that under the degree of the, again, this test they're using, the economic interrelationship between the two activities, a Colorado medical cannabis business, the petitioner in this case, the court held was a single entity because their non-cannabis products, which were pipes and papers, merely complemented its efforts to sell cannabis. I mean, there's so many good cases here. There's so much good case law. Another, and not good in terms of for the business owners, but just great to read. There's another famous case, Harborside, in 2018. The court held that Harborside had a single trader business because Harborside dedicated the lion's share of its resources to selling cannabis and cannabis products, which sales accounted for over 99% of its revenue. Now, let's see, where did we stop? Let's see, where did I leave you guys off with? Oh, yeah. Okay, so reading Olive and Champ together, good works or community involvement are not sufficient by themselves to support a tax deduction outside the application of 280E. In order to be deductible, this non-cannabis activity must be considered a separate trade or business entered into with a motive to realize profit. If a cannabis business owner is to have any hope of wielding the second line of business argument, they must be prepared to show that the alternate business line is extensive enough to stand on its own without the cannabis part of the business. Reading the case law, a court is more likely to accept a separate business activity if the business owner shows that business line would be viable even in the absence of sale of cannabis. If the business owner asserts it has a second line of business, they should treat it like a second line of business, accounting separately for its income and expenses so that if the IRS or tax courts are kind enough to agree with you, the amount of deductible expenses are readily available.